Buses are a-comin', oh yes. Buses are a-comin', oh yes.
In May of 1961, the Freedom Rides began. 13 people were assembled, 7 blacks and 6 whites, to ride buses from Washington, D.C. to Virginia, travel through the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and finish at New Orleans. Their purpose was to force the desegregation of buses and bus terminals on their route. The Supreme Court had ruled that segregation in any interstate facilities, such as bus terminals and the buses themselves, was unconstitutional. But the ruling was not implemented in many cities. There were 2 Supreme Court cases, one in 1946 and one in 1960. Both were very similar. Morgan v. Virginia held a court hearing that ruled 7-1 in the state, stating that segregation in interstate bus terminals was unconstitutional. The other hearing was Boynton v. Virginia, which occurred 14 years later. Occurring in the same state, the case was overturned, convicting an African-American law student of trespassing in a whites-only restaurant in a bus facility. The Freedom Riders were sponsored by a nonviolent civil rights group begun by James Farmer, called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE for short. The plan was to desegregate each stop along the way by testing the Jim Crow laws of the South. Jim Crow was a racist portrayal of blacks in America. The Jim Crow laws, however, were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. Even though most segregation laws had been struck down by the Supreme Court, Jim Crow laws had snuck their way back into the South. Volunteers risked their lives to make an impact and show how bad segregation and inequality was in the South, hoping people would have a change of heart. With their lives in danger, some endured brutal attacks, but even though some riders backed out after being attacked many times by white mobs, most stayed in until they reached New Orleans. Due to their effective use of the media, the Freedom Riders successfully communicated the brutality they faced, which proved to be the most influential force to desegregating travel in America. Even more, the actions of the Freedom Riders became the key to opening the door of desegregation for blacks.
Many individuals at the time were trying to take a stand against segregation, with speeches and leading protests such as civil rights leaders Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. King's electrifying speeches led people to follow him in his dream to a better place where there is no segregation or inequality. Unfortunately, it would have taken a lot more for people to notice all of the injustices towards blacks in America. In the beginning, the Freedom Riders drew little to no attention. However, 2 days into their journey, a mob approached them in Rock Hill, South Carolina, where the riders were beaten. The highlights of the event was when riders Albert Bigelow, who was white, and John Lewis, who was black, were both trampled when entering the colored and white waiting rooms, respectively. While they kept moving from state to state, the Freedom Riders also faced the brutality of the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, who showed them no mercy. One of the leaders of the riders, Jim Peck, even had to leave for his mental health due to the beating he received. The Freedom Riders were on the edge, riding a thin line that could ruin their whole plan. They were provided little protection against these violent protests, with a number of riders needing hospital care, but local hospital staff were not willing to treat their injuries at all.
In Alabama, they had been left defenseless, and Bull Connor, chief of safety of Birmingham at the time, failed to provide any police protection for the riders because it was Mother's Day. The violence became so gruesome that Corps officials couldn't find a bus driver that would continue the rides. Thankfully, news photographers from the area were able to take quick pictures of the seriously injured riders. Alabama police were trying their hardest to cover up the injuries from appearing in photographs, but they weren't successful in doing so. Tommy Langston, a photographer for the Birmingham Post, ended up being beaten instead. They destroyed the camera, but the photo produced the picture regardless. It is called "The Shot Heard Around the World," after the picture popped on news stations everywhere. The Freedom Riders had a lot of doubters and critics, and one person in particular, who should have been on their side, doubted them. Martin Luther King Jr. gave little support to the Freedom Riders, always avoiding the topic, which created tension between him and the riders. King even told Jet reporter Simeon Booker, "You will never make it through Alabama." But the Freedom Riders were proving Dr. King wrong, and people around the U.S. soon began to pay attention to the news reports that spread even throughout the whole world. The news eventually reached Attorney General Robert Kennedy, brother of then-President John F. Kennedy, who also didn't take a liking to the riots, including the Southern state residents. Many more politicians didn't like the way the Freedom Riders were going about protesting, knowing that they were riding into segregated areas. A significant portion of the general population believed that the Freedom Riders movement was provocative and that they were labeled troublemakers.
The Freedom Riders became stuck in Alabama due to Governor John Patterson not allowing the riots to continue in the state. Attorney General Kennedy went down to Alabama to speak with Governor Patterson about resuming the rides. After some very heavy negotiations over a number of days, the rides were finally resumed on May 20th, and the Freedom Riders received a police escort out of the city. But then, the police left them alone again. The riders had no choice but to continue the rides through Birmingham, Alabama, where they were met with a mob, once more all armed with bats. Finally, President Kennedy had enough and summoned over 600 federal marshals to the state premises. The following night, as Martin Luther King Jr. held a service at a church in Montgomery, which was attended by many riders, a mob viciously bombed the church. Governor Patterson then called in the National Guard.
Following the deadly church attack, the Freedom Riders continued on to Jackson, Mississippi, where they were taken to Parchman Penitentiary, a labor camp for 30 days for breach of peace. While in jail, they sang modified gospel songs and had the slogan, "Jail No Bail." Their goal was to fill the jails and complicate the prison system. The guards became so upset with the singing that they took their mattresses and toothbrushes away. They still sang to the very end. By then, many people across the country became outraged that the peaceful riders were jailed for absolutely no reason at all. Finally, under heavy pressure from the Kennedy administration, the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, issued regulations that prohibited segregation in any transmit terminals and buses. The Freedom Riders succeeded. By then, CORE fully expected President Kennedy to enforce civil rights for African Americans.
I thought we were going to go on a chain gang and be chopping cotton, which I thought that'll be an adventure. And honestly, it's better to be out in the field and chopping. Chopping cotton means to weed cotton. And it's better to be chopping cotton than sitting in the cell and doing nothing.
After the ICC guidelines in November 1961, a number of major pieces of legislation were enacted as a partial result of the Freedom Rides. In 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which legally ended segregation that existed because of the Jim Crow laws. The Voting Rights Act was passed a year later, 1965. This act prohibited state and local statutes that denied blacks from voting. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act passed that ended racial discrimination in renting and selling homes. So, it seems as though a firebombed burning bus in Anniston, terrorism by segregationists in Montgomery, and riots in a number of Deep South cities led directly to legal and social reforms during the 1960s. The Freedom Riders had a lot of courage to go through all of it, taking hit after hit just to finish the ride. The rides sent a huge message and impacted the civil rights movement. At the time, it didn't have the huge impact that shook the world as they hoped, but as time went on, it proved to be a huge movement. With the help of the media, the Freedom Riders communicated their message that equal opportunities for blacks were still not guaranteed, but they would fight until they would see justice in America.
And I went to step down out of the paddy wagon. It was a big step, and I'm short. And the police officer, who was holding the door open, reached over and took my arm to help me down and said, "We don't want anything to happen to you children." And that gave me faith that things were going to work out okay in the end.